perhaps I should start in the spirit of Jeremy Corbyn this morning by making two declarations myself. They're as follows. I don't make jam, and I don't have an allotment. I do, and I want to make this real. I do have a back garden, and my spring onions are doing rather well. Put that on the record. All right, let me turn to the matter in hand. There are two basic reasons why we do need to spend some time talking about China. One is clear and obvious. The other is slightly delicate. I'll take the clear and obvious one first. China is now the second largest economy in the world. It accounts for something in the region of 17% of nominal GDP. To the United States, it's 26%. More to the point, it is the leading manufacturer today, accounting for 35% of global manufacturing production, compared to the United States, 12%. And it is the second greatest military spender to the United States at the moment. So that's the key reason why we need to think a little about China and the nature of the Chinese state. The significance of this growth was appreciated some time back. I mean, it was Obama, in fact, who initiated the policy shift in the United States to the so-called pivot to Asia. Trump has been a critic of the progress of this because he wishes to accelerate it. And the protectionist tariffs that he is now seeking to impose are all about, in a sense, stemming the rise of the new imperialist kid on the block, if I can put it like that, and seeking to undermine it in some shape or form. So in order to understand what's going on, we do need to look carefully at China and try to understand where it's coming from and where it's going. The other reason that I think we do need to talk about China is the slightly more delicate fact that there is a body of opinion on the left, shared by personal friends of mine, I hasten to add, well-respected activists and others, that China in fact represents a progressive, if not in fact socialist alternative to the United States, and that it is indeed an alternative not just to that, but to the whole competitive world system that we describe with that word capitalism. And I think we need to consider that argument. I mean, on one level, I do understand where it's coming from, I should say. And part of it comes from a good place, the wish to see some alternative to the United States, some alternative to the imperialist adventurism of the United States and its domination of things. And to the idea that there is something concrete out there that is currently in the process of creating a better world. So there is a sense in which I can see where that's coming from. And it reminds me very much of a situation that I recall from quite a few years back now, but going back in fact to 1999, when this country, in alliance with the United States, bombed a country I originally come from, or at least my parents do, Serbia. And some of you here may recall that in the course of that bombing, the United States bombed, apparently accidentally, the Chinese embassy in central Belgrade. And I recall very well there were actually Serbs at that time who obviously now looked to China in the hope that somehow China would save them from the horrors of the bombing that would then ensue. So I can understand where this is coming from, but at the same time I do think it's important that we look at this carefully and coolly and we reach some clear and objective assessments of the Chinese state. What of the Chinese state then? Years back there was a clever Greek bloke called Aristotle who once said that if you want to understand the nature of something, look at how it is formed. Look how it came about. That will give you a good clue as to its nature. And that's precisely what I briefly intend to do here. Because I want to look at what I would call three key turning points in the history of the Chinese Communist Party in order to see how it has shifted its class loyalties in the course of its history, because I think that is the best way of getting a properly historical and materialist understanding of how the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese state have become what they are today. To that end, then, let me take the first starting point. I'm going to label 1927. I know that's going back a bit, but I hope you'll see the logic of what I'm trying to say here. The Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party, was formed by a small bunch of Chinese intellectuals in 1921, and the purpose of that formation was very much to model themselves on Lenin's Bolsheviks, successful revolution they had led in Russia in 1917, and to build a party that was rooted precisely and very clearly on the urban working class, the working class of China's cities. First and foremost, that doesn't mean excluding the peasantry from this process, but making sure that the leading and the key element of this revolutionary party would be the urban working class. And in fact, to some degree, they were quite successful in doing so. The figures suggest that probably by the mid-1920s, they had reached something like 60,000 in terms of membership and were a not insignificant political force in China at the time, allying themselves, in fact, with the Chinese bourgeoisie led by Chiang Kai-shek in the hope that this would kick out the imperialists from China, particularly the British, the French, and the Japanese. Chiang Kai-shek turned on his erstwhile communist allies in 1927 and massacred them en masse in the cities. 40,000, it's estimated, communist militants were massacred, particularly in Shanghai, but across China. And the consequence of this is what I think we need to focus in a little bit in order to understand the contemporary Chinese Communist Party. The effect of this was essentially to shift the class loyalty of the party to a different class, from the urban working class to the peasants in the countryside. And this shift is a matter of real political and ideological significance in the history of this process. Before I consider that, though, let me make one thing very clear here. What happened afterwards was, in one sense, a roaring success. They were able to mobilize the peasants, militarize them in struggle against, in particular, Japanese imperialism, which invaded directly in 1931 and again in 1937. They were able, in that process, to defeat the Japanese in China, and indeed, ultimately, to defeat Chiang Kai-shek too, and take power in 1949. This was a progressive process. It was a victory against imperialism, and it created a China that was at last, in some sense, properly independent. It threw off imperialist and semi-colonial domination by foreign powers. So this was a progressive process. Let me make that clear. But to describe it as socialist is problematic, and I want to explain why it's problematic. It's problematic first and foremost because of the shift of class loyalties to the peasantry and away from the working class, which is always, according to the axioms of Marxism, the key social force for the creation of a socialist society. It reflected a fundamental shift from the concepts of internationalism to the notions of nationalism, to the idea that the process of the revolution would be to build a strong state that would be able to stand up to others, and in particular to compete with other states. And we see the start of a process here that ends up in a slogan that President Xi is very commonly uses, the notion that he calls the process currently going on in China as the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. These two things are interlinked. And we see how they're interlinked when the Chinese Communist Party took power in 1949. It told the working class in the cities to be quiescent, wait for their liberation from outside. And it then began a process of shifting its class loyalties away from the peasantry that had brought it to power to the state bureaucracy that it then formed in its endeavor to develop the productive forces of China in order to be able to stand up, to catch up with, and ultimately overtake the West in particular, Britain and the United States. What they were doing, therefore, was imbibing the logic of competition into China. And the effects of this would be, by the end of the first decade of their rule, barbaric. What do I mean by that? They would firstly turn on the very class that brought into power, the peasantry. And they handed, in the first instance, peasants the land that they had been yearning for. But by the end of the 1950s, they were herding the peasants off their land into peasant commune in an attempt to force the pace of industrialization by squeezing as much of a surplus out of the agricultural sector, out of the peasants, by getting them off their private plots and ensuring the surplus could be grabbed by the state in order to be channeled into heavy industrial production. That logic was the logic of competition. It was all about ensuring catch-up with the United States and with Britain. And indeed, the slogan of this so-called Great Leap Forward, as it was called, was overtake Britain, catch up with the United States. The results of this were barbaric. The Great Famine followed. The estimates are that perhaps between 15 to 55 million Chinese died in what followed. And the result politically for Mao, who was leading this whole process and was the figurehead most associated with it, was that he was weakened politically. And what we see emerging then, as a result of this second turning point from 1949 onwards, is this, that pro-marketeers decided this was a better model to follow in the years to come. China could catch up Britain and the United States by using market mechanisms now, not Mao's Stalinist obsession with the state as the means to catch up with the West. And they started to develop support within the Chinese Communist Party, and Mao was increasingly isolated at the top of the Chinese state. So much so that in the end he decided he had no option but to go outside the party structures to the Chinese youth and appeal to them, to attack, to vilify those who were arguing that market reforms was the way forward. They were condemned, therefore, as capitalist roaders who were taking the capitalist road and deserved to be condemned. Many of them were, many died. The estimates, I don't know, into millions run as to how many died in the process of this cultural revolution, as it was called. But unlike some on the left who, some now who think the same, the French philosopher Alain Badiou, for example, thinks the Cultural Revolution was a fantastic radical event. In fact, it was nothing of the kind. It was a brutal struggle between two sections of the Chinese ruling class. Would the market dominate China in the future of the state? Now, Mao won, in a sense, but his victory was Pyrrhic. When he died in 1976, Stalinists like him were quickly purged by the marketeers who really did dominate the party structures and the state structures. So much so that in 1978, Deng Xiaoping, who now took over, a victim at one point of the Cultural Revolution, took over and announced that China would now move in a market reform direction and begin the process of integrating itself into the world economy. And the shift that then took place of millions and millions of peasants from the countryside to the cities, which has been the key element in the massive rise of China in the last 40 years, is what then commenced. Market reforms were gradually introduced. The ability to set up private businesses was introduced beyond simply the limit of 5 employees. In 1999, the Chinese constitution was amended to say that the private sector was an important component of the Chinese economy. In 2001, the Chinese Communist Party officially admitted capitalists into party membership. 2004, the constitution was amended to give everyone the right to private property. The phenomenal growth, therefore, that has now taken place, you can see the direction it is going in. And we see this very clearly, I think, from a speech that President Xi gave in 2018 to the Symposium on Private Enterprises. He said this. It's 40 years on since 1978 here. He's talking in 2018. This year marks the 40th anniversary of reform and opening up. Over the past 40 years, the country's private economy has grown from small to large, from weak to strong. The private economy, he added, has the characteristics of 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. What on earth did he mean by that? He went on to say, namely, it contributes more than 50% of taxes, more than 60% of GDP, more than 70% of technological innovation results, more than 80% of urban employment, and more than 90% of the number of enterprises. And he then went on in a way that may be familiar to some of you. For a long time, private entrepreneurs have organized and led millions of workers to work hard, start businesses with arduous efforts, and innovate continuously with their pioneering spirit of innovation and perseverance. The private economy has made an indispensable contribution to the country's economic development and the creation of the Chinese miracle. The net result of all this is, I think, clear from the comments that I came across in, of all things, the Harvard Business Review, which I like flicking through from time to time. And there, a Chinese CEO of a multi-billion private equity firm was asked, what is it that Americans don't understand about China? And he said this, and it says a lot. They don't know how capitalist China is, he said. China is among the most open markets in the world. He was talking 2020, I think, so things have moved on slightly, but nevertheless, the key point remains. China is among the most open markets in the world, and he added, in 2020, China had more billionaires than the US did, and it outpaces the US 3-1 in minting them. Consequently, inequality is greater in China than in the United States, measured by the Gini coefficient, the standard measure of inequality. So, when, as you sometimes hear the phrase repeated, that Deng Xiaoping coined back in the 1970s when he spoke about socialism with Chinese characteristics, my case is this: is it not better really to talk here of capitalism with Chinese characteristics? So where does this get us at the end of the day? China is now faced with accelerating tensions, of course, stemming from the Trump administration, and it clearly, as the second largest economy in the world, with a developing military, its military expenditure in 2025 is set to go up by 7.2%, something in the region of $246 billion. It has, ship for ship, the largest navy in the world, although American ships are larger. It is a nuclear power and has got the largest army in the world. So it's not going to take this competition lying down. It's going to, in fact, seek to defend its own interests, because the logic of competition that has been key to the Chinese Communist Party is now a central feature, of course, the way it operates, and has been for many a year. It took the original statist model as the way of competing with the West in order to build up its productive forces, and now, having done so, it has turned to the free market in order to take international advantage of its productive power, just as Britain did back in Victorian times and the United States did in the 20th century. There was nothing really fundamentally different about this process. So what we're facing really is a process of intensification, and I just want to say a word or two about really what the alternative is here, because I think it needs clear statement. The Chinese Communist Party abandoned the working class in the 1920s, many years ago. It is now a ruling class which is composed of state capitalists and private capitalists, a combination of the two that's not fundamentally different from much of the rest of the world economy that mixes the state and the private. It is, in a sense, a public-private partnership writ large. In fact, you can't write it much larger than that, probably. So what about the role of the workers? I mean, workers in China are without fundamental democratic rights. Their attempt to play a role in seeking them together with the students in Tiananmen Square in 1989 led to the terrible slaughter in that square. However, the Chinese working class is one of the largest working classes in the world. It is in the process of developing consciousness. The suggestion, certainly so far as strike rates in recent years, suggests that this is a process that is happening. And what I simply would say is that I understand why people look to the Chinese state as their chosen alternative. The truth is it isn't an alternative. But there is an alternative in China. That is the working class. And it is the same alternative as the one we have here. Thanks very much.